Alrighty, welcome back everybody for another week of Championship Review. This is the show where we go through each week's scores and stats from around the URC. And this week will be our Week 4 recap of URC results and stats. So without further ado, let's get into it. First thing we're going to look at is just a quick recap of Week 4's schedule here. So last Friday, there were 3 games played, and then the rest of the 5 games were played the following Saturday. And let's just jump right into it. The first game from Friday that we're going to go over is the Connacht Vodacom Bowls game. For me, this was the first game I watched this past weekend. This was a heck of a game to start the week, I'm not going to lie. I came all the way down to the end of it. Controversial red card in there, potentially. But we'll let that be for everybody else to draw their opinions on. So let's jump right into the stats here. And we have Connacht in the green ink. Bulls are in the black ink. Now, the first part that I would like to zoom in on is this top half here of the stats table. And as we can see, possession and territory, extremely favorited towards Connacht, with both being 63% in favor of Connacht, 37% towards the Bulls side. So, to see the Bulls come out with a victory, despite the fact that Connacht was dominant in both possession and territory, pretty impressive here. And then if you also look at the tackles made category, you have 124 for Connacht, 274 tackles for the Bulls for this entire game. That paints your picture right there. Look at the possession, look at the territory. Connacht is the dominant team on offense. The Bulls had to play an incredible mountain of defense just to hang in this game. I'm pretty impressed with the Bulls' outcome as it was, considering, again, they're over twice the amount of tackles, and it's such a wide discrepancy of possession and territory that the fact that this game was as close as it was, to me, is pretty impressive. And then if we move a little further down the sheet here, you can just continue to see a lot of stats were favoring Connacht during the course of this game. Meters carried, turnovers won, defenders beaten. A lot of offensive stats were in the favor of Connacht, yet slight more discipline from the Bulls, in which they have 6 penalties versus 9, And then their line break or fast break opportunities, 9 versus 7. May not seem like a lot, but when it's the 1-point victory, very small details of less penalties conceded, more line break opportunities could be the one and only reason as to why, red card too, as to why Bulls came out in front of this game. Again, 20-minute red card also plays a huge factor in that as well. Our second game from the Friday slot was a shocker, to me at least. Edinburgh 43, Benetton 0. If you had seen the way Benetton played the previous week, I would have thought this would have been a much closer game, but I think Italian rugby teams are kind of like French rugby teams. Once they leave their home field advantage, they don't play as well as you've seen them play previously. Or they don't play nearly as well when they're at home. And let's take a look at the stat line here, because I think that will definitely kind of hammer home the fact that Italian teams on the road may not play nearly as well as when they are at home, protecting the fortress, so to speak. So if we zoom in, possession and territory stats coincidentally were the exact same as the Bulls and Connacht game, And I should mention we have Benetton in the green ink and Edinburgh in the black ink. So again, possession and territory heavily favorited Edinburgh in this game, and that scoreline definitely showcases that dominance that Edinburgh had during the entire game with possession and territory. Look a little bit further south on the stat sheet here. We have another game with 200 tackles for Benetton in this situation, only 113. Not to say that 113 is a small amount, but when it's compared to 200, very large discrepancy there of what team is playing offense more and what team is playing defense more. And that is very much emphasized by the stats that we're seeing here. 505 meters carried for Edinburgh, 185 for Benetton. That's a lot. That's a very big discrepancy in between the two there, which tells me Edinburgh's offense was humming and on the ball this particular game. If you look at penalties conceded for Edinburgh this game was about half of what it was last week. In addition, 0 yellow cards for Edinburgh this week. Better discipline, 15 players on the field for the entire game. Edinburgh they really showed that the way they played against Munster last week wasn't necessarily a fluke. When they don't shoot themselves in the foot, having all of those yellow cards, that's just really showcasing how good of a team this Edinburgh team really, truly is. So it'll be interesting to see where Edinburgh progresses from here, to see if they can just maintain their discipline, and if they can, it'll be very exciting to see just where they'll end up being. And our last game for Friday was a lovely Welsh derby. You had Dragons 17, Cardiff 24. So this was a very close game. Good bounce-back game for the Dragons after being skunked last week. And good continuation for Cardiff. I think this is their second win in a row. So this is good momentum for Cardiff right now. Going into our stat sheet here, we have Cardiff in the blue ink. Dragons are in the black ink. And let's just immediately jump in and zoom in, where we've got Dragons with better possession, better territory. Tackle stats are pretty close, but you still have less tackles being made by Dragons, which, just looking at those tells me that Dragons were in charge, playing offense a little bit more, making less tackles. But if we slide down a little further on the stat sheet here, having the ball a little bit more, playing in better parts of the field a little bit more, didn't really benefit them, unfortunately, in this scenario. Cardiff had a little bit more meters gained. I mean, honestly, as you look at all of these, let's just kind of go back real quick. A lot of these, offensive stats are favoring Dragons. So I don't know what caused the Dragons to not be clinical and be effective and take advantage. But yeah, as you can see up top here, a lot of stats favoring the Dragons, except for tackle completions. But then when you slide down to the bottom half here, the only thing that didn't favor the Dragons was meters carried, and they only had 8 less meters carried than Cardiff, so not a huge gap there. But something tells me Dragons really left an opportunity on the table, because based off this stat line here, Dragons were the better team. They just didn't take their opportunities when they had them. Moving on to Saturday. It's another tough pill to swallow as a Scarlets fan. However, I got to give credit where credit is due. They played better this week than they did last week. Unfortunately, Emirates Lions got the better of them and, ended up getting the victory. So if we take a peek at the stats here, Scarlets are in the red ink, Lions are in the black ink, and again, as a Scarlets fan, I want to see them win every game, but if you look at the scoreline, 29 Lions, 18 Scarlets. Take a peek at that possession and territory, heavily favorited towards the Lions, which to me, given the scoreline, these possession and territory stats make a lot of sense. Lions are scoring more, they have more ball, they're playing in better parts of the field. Just going to lead to more scoring opportunities. And I really think if we zoom in towards the bottom of the stat sheet here, I really think Lions having more offensive opportunities can really be seen by these bottom 5 stats here. Meters carried, they have over twice the amount of meters gained as Scarlets on this one. Huge amount of defenders beaten and an insane amount of line breaks. You have 32 defenders that are getting beaten at the line, which then led to 18 line break or fast break opportunities. The only thing I can say that saved the Scarlets this week from not getting completely embarrassed was their defensive effort. 9 turnovers won and only 9 penalties this week. Last week, I can't remember how many turnovers they had, but last week they had 20 penalties conceded during the entire game, 15 in the first half. So really, really big improvement in the discipline category here for the Scarlets, which again, I think is the only reason that they didn't get absolutely taken to the cleaners was defensive effort and discipline. So again, as a Scarlets fan, I like to see the positive momentum from, not a great start to the season. So hopefully they can keep having positive progress as the weeks go on. And then for the Lions, maybe this can be the start of, a nice little win streak for them to get them further off the bottom of the table. Our next Saturday game going to be between the Sharks and Ulster. I know this is a big improvement for the Sharks from last week because I don't think they played Leinster last week, if I remember correctly, and Leinster dominated that game over the Sharks. So pretty decent bounce back for the Sharks, just scoring more points, taking better opportunities if the chances they get on offense. Continued good streak for Ulster here, getting the victory. So let's look at the stats here, going up to the stat sheet. Now, one thing that I find interesting is this was kind of like the Dragons Cardiff game. So if we zoom in here, we can see Sharks are in the black ink, Ulster is in the red ink here. Territory favors the Sharks, and Sharks were playing in much more advantageous parts of the field, as you can see based off the territory stat there. And even if you're looking at the tackle stats here, less, not significantly less, but there is, a good chunk of tackles, less tackles made by the Sharks versus Ulster. Got 151 for Ulster, 121 for the Sharks. So this tells me Sharks playing less defense and have more offensive opportunity. However, that was not necessarily taken. So if we kind of slide down here, really hone in on the meters carried part, despite possession and territory favoring the Sharks, Sharks had only 239 meters carried versus 316 for Ulster. So again, despite having more territory, despite having more possession, Sharks were not able to take advantage of that opportunity and, turn it into many scoring opportunities. Now, if we look even further down the sheet here, it's very interesting to see 8 turnovers, 1 for Ulster versus 1 for the Sharks. We see the possession and we see the territory stats favoring Sharks, but then you see this huge discrepancy with turnovers. Ulster's defense was clicking and on the ball today because they're stopping the Sharks and turning the Sharks over, not allowing offensive continuity for the Sharks with their 8 turnovers. Now, Ulster was able to take those turnovers and turn them into line breaks, as you can see by the 10 line breaks for Ulster versus 6. So Ulster has more fast break opportunities, more opportunities to get the Sharks playing defense on the back foot. Now, the one thing I am very surprised about right now, A, looking at these stats, the outcome is surprising, and B, the outcome is surprising because of this penalties conceded line here, 6 versus 17. The discipline for Ulster here is shockingly bad for this particular game, and the fact that Sharks could not take advantage of the ill discipline for Ulster, kind of surprising. And by kind of, I mean very. You don't see too many times where a team's coming out with a potential bonus point victory having given up 17 penalties. Be that as it may, the lovely world of sports has the outcome being the way that it is. So even sometimes when you play bad, you can still win the game. Let's move on to the lovely Irish derby of the week. I was very excited for this game, the Leinster-Munster game. Now, let's not beat around the bush too much here. Let's just get right into the stat line here. So, as I was watching this game, I genuinely thought Munster played way better than Leinster did. What I was not expecting was a heavily lopsided stat line favoring Leinster. So what I mean by that is, let's zoom in just on the top half here with Munster again in red, Leinster with the black ink. It's just so heavily dominated towards Leinster. Let me zoom back out here real quick. Possession territory. This is one of the more lopsided stat lines of the week right here, where Leinster, hugely in favor of possession, hugely in favor of territory, yet they weren't able to do anything with it. So if we zoom in, right, let's look at the tackles here. 117 for Leinster, 271 for Munster this week. Again, as I was watching this game, I could tell that Munster was, playing a lot of defense. I just didn't realize that it was this much of a difference. This is impressive how much of a difference this is between the amount of defense Munster was playing versus Leinster. In addition, you can kind of see that with the meters carried stat. The offense for Leinster was humming and doing great. They made almost 600 meters carried during the course of the game. They almost doubled the output of meters carried of Munster. Munster's defense, though, is what won the game. Hands down. Look at the turnovers one stat. 15 for Munster, 5. Only 5 for Leinster. So there's 15 offensive opportunities that Munster is stopping, turning around and taking advantage of. But again, I will be a little surprised to see the scoreline the way that it was, given how many penalties Munster conceded. Again, you got to give credit where credit is due. Defense 100% won this game for Munster. And it was really impressive to see just the physical domination of Munster versus Leinster. Now moving on to what I believe to be the second to last game for our Saturday slot here. Zebri Parma, 13, DHL Stormers, 31. Now, this game was played in Italy, so if you look at the stats here, game was played in Italy, which means Zebri played much better than the game that they played last week. And if we zoom in, we can kind of see that from possession and territory, mostly from possession territory, 51 versus 49. It's essentially an even 50-50 split. Zebri is with the black ink, Stormers with the blue ink. But, you look at possession, look at the overall territory. Possession's favoriting Parma more versus the territory is. But if you look at the tackle stats here, 81 tackles for Parma, 129 for the Stormers, showcasing Stormers were playing defense a little bit more, quite a bit more, than Parma was. However, if we kind of take a peek a little further down the stat sheet here, offensive opportunities were taken aplenty by Stormers. So look at the defenders beaten, look at the line breaks. 16 defenders beaten and 10 line break opportunities for the Stormers. Despite the fact that Stormers may have been on defense more often than Parma was, the times where Stormers did get the ball and did go on offense, they took their opportunities and were scoring the ball much more than Parma was. Now, if we move to our last game of the week and of Saturday, we've got Ospreys 17, Glasgow 42. What I will say about this before we look at the stat sheet is if Glasgow had a slow start to the season, they no longer are playing slow by any stretch of the imagination. This is the second week in a row where they've put up 40-plus points against their opposition. And this is the second week in a row where they've been very dominant over the team that they're playing. So let's take a peek at the stat sheet here. We've got Glasgow in this light blue color, Ospreys in the black ink, and just from a bird's eye view overview, possession, territory heavily favorited towards Glasgow. And honestly, let's just zoom in, because I think looking at these top stat lines here, to me, explains everything on how Glasgow is just so much more dominant than Glasgow is so much more dominant than the Ospreys were during this game. So you have overall possession 58 versus 42, and then the territory is where it really separates, where you have 68% versus 32%. So you have Glasgow holding on to the ball more, and they're playing in Ospreys half more often than not. 2/3 of the game, Glasgow's playing in better parts of the field and holding on to the ball more versus what the Ospreys are doing. This was the week of huge numbers of tackles for teams. As you can see with the tackles made stat, it's 210 tackles. 200 tackles during a rugby game is a gargantuan number. And you just see something like this stacked on top of the territory and possession stats. It's not really a wonder to me how this became so lopsided, but I am a little surprised because previous weeks, Ospreys looked like they were playing well, looked like they were being somewhat clinical and disciplined, but, you come up against a well-oiled machine of Glasgow, and sometimes they just humble you quite a bit. So that's it for the games for week 4. Now, what we're going to move into is a look at the live ladder. On the left there, we've got the live ladder as of last Monday, October 13th. And then on the right side, we have the live ladder from this past Monday, October 20th. The interesting thing, top 8 has not changed at all. The one thing that I did notice looking at both of these, if you look at the top 6 teams in the ladder, they're starting to separate themselves from the bottom 9 afterwards. And it looks, you have Benetton at 7. Can definitely throw Ospreys down there at 13. If Sharks and Dragons start winning, they'll be definitely put in this conversation. So again, you have top 6 separating themselves from the pack, but then Benetton at 7 all the way down to Ospreys at 13. Those teams are tight enough in points where, seed number 7, seed number 8 could really be a hot competition as the weeks move on and the weeks progress here. And the last thing we will be looking at is just week 5 schedule. So today we've got a really good game of Glasgow and Vodacom Bulls going. So let's see if Glasgow can keep their dominant streak going. And it'll be interesting to see how the Bulls are doing after a huge defensive effort this past week. So again, 1 game on Friday, and then 7 games going to be on Saturday. One of the main games I'm looking at, again, is the Hollywood Bets Sharks Scarlets game. Let's go Scarlets. And then, let's see, what other games do we have interesting here? We've got a lot of pretty interesting games going on. Welsh Derby, Dragons versus Ospreys. Yeah. So again, here's week 5. Hope everybody enjoys the games in this up and coming week. Goodbye for now.